Hey, what's up, everyone? GoodMicWork Commentaries back at you with another retro pay-per-view review. This video is sponsored by awesome Patreon supporter Scott Moss, who has taken advantage of one of the tiers on Patreon to have a review done on any wrestling show of his choosing. And he's chosen a doozy for us. I remember this one well. We should have a good time taking a look back at this 31-year-old show and what was going on in wrestling at the time and how I perceived and experienced this event. Because we are in the middle of this COVID-19 pandemic, and I have a lot more free time on my hands being currently out of work until this thing passes, I decided to reopen up these Patreon tiers in case anybody wanted to support the channel, and it would give me an opportunity to do extra videos and provide you guys extra content since I definitely have the extra time. And just so you guys know, even though I am out of work right now, I am doing completely fine. I am not in any danger, at least right now, financially or anything like that, and I expect to be back at work when this is all over. So that's not what this is about. This is mostly about just giving me an opportunity to do more reviews. And I love some of the shows that you guys have been recommending so far, and I have 2 more future Patreon reviews already in queue in the next couple of weeks. So you're going to get some more of these. If for any reason you choose or would like information on how to participate in this, the link to my Patreon page is right there at the top of the description. You can go over there and check it out yourself. Otherwise, all I really want from anyone is your eyes and your ears and your likes. Let's try to hook up Scott Moss here. He was very awesome for contributing to the channel like this, and let's hook him up and show him that we're not all idiots and give him at least a couple of 100 likes here. Scott, again, I want to thank you very much for being the reason that this video is being produced, and he kind of stays off social media, so otherwise I would be plugging anything that he had. And that is something else I will do for future videos. If anybody has a YouTube channel or social media or anything like that you need plugged, I'll be sure to do that in the video. But Scott just wants himself a review, so that's what Scott's going to get. And I'm hoping that a good portion of my audience, or at least some of you, are old enough to remember this show, or even if you're not old enough to remember it, maybe you're at an age that you've since gone back and watched it several times, or you're at least familiar with it and what was going on at the time. 1989 was an interesting year. I remember it well. I watched all of the pay-per-views, all 3 of them. I don't actually know. I'm just 3. I don't think I watched the Royal Rumble that year in 89, but I did watch WrestleMania, SummerSlam, and Survivor Series, and this was the second reign of Hulk Hogan after he beat Macho Man Randy Savage at WrestleMania 5, and he had been off doing the movie No Holds Barred the previous year, and that's when they brought in Zeus to kind of feud with Hogan throughout the late part of 1989, and that was all kind of coming to a head here, and it was just really interesting, some of the pairings they had on the show, some of the teammates, some of the storylines that were going on, and this was a pretty loaded Survivor Series card, so it's going to be fun to take a look back at this show because I have, like I said, I have lots and lots of memories of it, and there are some really interesting internal stories going on at this show as well. So enough jaw-jacking here, let's get right into WWF Survivor Series 1989. Went down on Thanksgiving night, November 23rd, 1989, from the Rosemont Horizon in Chicago, Illinois. We had Gorilla Monsoon and Jesse Ventura on the call for this thing. Now, this was still back when they were doing the Thanksgiving night Survivor Series, and I really liked those. I thought that was so cool back in the day, but I think they would only do this for the first 4 years, I want to say. I want to say the next year in 1990 was the last one, and then after that, they moved it to Thanksgiving Eve, and then a few years after that, they started running them on Sunday nights, which began in 1995. And this Survivor Series was also unique because it had really deviated from the previous 2 years. 1987 and 1988 looked very much the same. There wasn't a women's match in 88, but there was one in 87, but the matches were kind of structured the same. You had your big main event match that involved Hulk Hogan and whoever he was feuding with at the time, and then you had your underneath match with a lot of the Intercontinental title contenders all bunched up there together, and then you had a big match with all of the tag teams, which was like a 20-man tag, 10 men on each side, and that's what they did in 1987 and 1988. And the teams in the first 2 years were 5-man teams. They changed everything up in 1989. WWF looked vastly different during the span of this 1 year. So instead of 5-man teams here in 1989, we're only having 4-man teams, and they've added an extra match and done away with the giant tag team match. As a matter of fact, some of these tag teams, they had split up. Bret Hart and Jim the Anvil Neidhart were split up into singles at this time, and they were on separate teams. So the tag team division was really nothing compared to what it was, I think, the previous couple of years. And I don't think they had enough teams to even fill a match like that. So they kind of did away with it here and also shortened up the size of the teams, which kind of sucked. Because in the first couple of Survivor Series, the tagline was teams of 5 strive to survive. And now it's teams of 4 strive to survive. It just doesn't sound right. But they fucking said it anyway. So the show opens up with a montage of all of the WWF superstars saying what they're thankful for. It really looked like they were just shuffling these guys in and out and knocked out all these promos at once because nobody was even being creative. Usually they're thankful for themselves or their tagline or whatever. If they have a pet like Damien, Jake Roberts is thankful for Damien. If you have $1 million like the $1 Million Man, $1 Million Man's thankful that he has $1 million. It was just one thing after another. Really kind of pointless to even do that, but it was Thanksgiving night, and that's what you do. This was also back in the day when Vince McMahon would have his really over-the-top rundown of the card prior to the event. He did this for a few Survivor Series, and it was a really hilarious audio edit in Macho Man Randy Savage's team because one of his partners was supposed to be Barry Windham. We'll talk about that later, and he was replaced last minute by the Earthquake, and to hear Vince have to redub that part, it really didn't fit in audio-wise, and it was a terrible piece of editing, but I got a kick out of it. And our opening match here was the Enforcers versus the Dream Team. Now, the Enforcers consisted of the Big Boss Man, who was the team captain, Bad News Brown, Rick the Model Martel, and the Honky Tonk Man. The Dream Team consisted of Dusty Rhodes, the Red Rooster, Tito Santana, and Brutus the Barber Beefcake. This was right after Dusty came into the company. He was only there for a couple of months. He had just started wearing the polka dots, and I don't even think he was with Sapphire yet. His first feud in the company was with the Big Boss Man, and Dusty was kind of wearing tie-dye around his early days coming into the WWE, but it was cool that they feuded him with Boss Man first because if I remember the story of Ray Traylor's career, I want to say it was Dusty that kind of recognized his ability and put him out on TV after he watched him, in a match or take a bump or something like that, if I remember the story right. So they've got some history from the NWA. It was kind of cool to see them link up in Dusty's inaugural feud in the WWE. This was a pretty wild match, a lot of fun, and pretty much what you'd expect from all these pros in the ring. You had Rick Martel, who recently at WrestleMania 5 turned on Tito Santana and disbanded the Strike Force. He eliminated Tito with a handful of tights. So Tito Santana is gone at the hands of his former partner. In a really funny spot and extremely reminiscent of the previous year, Big Boss Man and Bad News Brown had a miscue. Boss Man hits Bad News by accident, and Bad News gets pissed, and he leaves. The very same thing happened the year before. As a matter of fact, last November, I did a live stream reviewing both Survivor Series 1987 and Survivor Series 1988 back-to-back. I should have mentioned that at the beginning of the podcast here. I'll throw the link in the upper right of the screen there for you if you guys want to check that out. But Bad News Brown did the same thing the previous year. He got pissed. I think he had a miscommunication with Valentine or something like that, got mad and left. So Bad News Brown stays true to his character, and he just does not get along with fucking anybody. And I always thought that was hilarious, that they would even put him on a Survivor Series team knowing that it's not going to work out. So he bails out, leaves the Boss Man team high and dry, which is pretty funny. Honky Tonk Man got eliminated next by Brutus Beefcake with a high knee. Really cool to see Brutus bust out the old finisher from time to time. He used to use the high knee as a finisher when he was a heel, if I remember right, before transitioning into the sleeper. Brutus Beefcake would also then eliminate Rick Martel after that. Brutus was one of their top guys, man. He was going to be teaming up with Hogan the following month to take on Randy Savage and Zeus in a huge cage match, which we will talk about later on. Next up, we had the Boss Man eliminating the Red Rooster with his side slam finish, and the match ends with Dusty Rhodes pinning the Big Boss Man with a high cross body. Big-ass Dusty Rhodes throwing a high cross body. Brutus the Barber Beefcake and Dusty Rhodes are your survivors. After the match, Boss Man retrieves his nightstick and starts attacking Dusty Rhodes and whipping him with the nightstick. Brudeye comes into the ring with a fucking murder weapon. He's got his hedge clippers there, and he chases off the Boss Man and celebrates with Dusty Rhodes. So Brutus and Dusty reign supreme in match 1. Next up, we had the 4x4s taking on the King's Court. The 4x4s were captained by Hacksaw Jim Duggan. He's joined by Hercules, Rugged Ronnie Garvin, and Bret the Hitman Hart. Taking on the King's Court, captained by Macho King, Randy Savage, Greg the Hammer Valentine, Dino Bravo, and the Earthquake. And it is interesting that the previous match, Dusty's team was named the Dream Team, and you have the Dream Team on Savage's team. Valentine and Bravo used to go by the Dream Team, or the new Dream Team anyway. And I also mentioned Earthquake earlier on. He had just come into the company as well. They had just run that angle, I think, on TV where they pulled him out of the crowd and he attacked the Ultimate Warrior. So he was fresh on the scene. and his spot was supposed to be occupied by Barry Windham, who had recently come in a few months prior to this as the Widowmaker. And I remember thinking he was in line for a big push. He went undefeated for a long time on TV. And I remember, like, being a pretty young kid, thinking that he was going to be a serious contender and being a little bit scared of him. Even though I remembered Wyndham from his previous run when he was a babyface and he had been in the NWA, for him to come in like this and get pushed so hard, I was thinking they were going to put the belt on this guy. But he had to back out of the match last minute and actually leave the WWE because the Wyndham family had gotten in that trouble like 30 years ago, where I think it was Blackjack and it was maybe Wyndham's brother Kendall. There was two Wyndhams that got busted for counterfeiting. You know, like $1 million in counterfeit bills and shit were found, and they were arrested, and they did like 2 years in prison each. So during that whole scandal running through the family, Barry had to leave. So he was replaced by the Earthquake last minute on this team, which worked out perfect because Earthquake was backing up Bravo anyway, and he would go on to have a huge year the following year. So this was only one of two last-minute replacements on this show. The next one would be in the main event, and I think this one worked out much better because Earthquake fit right in. It was really funny, too, when the teams were making their entrances. Hacksaw Jim Duggan at this time didn't have his theme music yet. The theme music that he would wind up using, like the following year, was kind of a rendition of Big John Studd's babyface theme that he used the same year in 1989. But they hadn't given that to Duggan yet, so the 4x4s, the entire team, came out there to no music. They should have played Brett's music. That would have been fucking awesome to have all those guys bouncing around out there to the Hart Foundation theme. And they all had 2x4s with them over their shoulder. So that was pretty hilarious, and they're a funny-looking fucking team. The King's Court gets on the board right away when Earthquake eliminates Hercules with his finisher. And these two guys would actually go on to become WrestleMania 6 opponents, right when they were really building Earthquake strong. The 4x4s even up the odds next when Hacksaw Jim Duggan eliminates Greg the Hammer Valentine. And after this, we start seeing a couple of different occasions during the match where Bret Hart and Randy Savage mixed it up. And that was a lot of fun because these guys worked together only a handful of times. And one of my favorite matches ever was on Saturday night's main event when Savage and Bret worked one-on-one. I think that was in early 88 or late 87. Pretty sure it was late 87. It was the Saturday night's main event after the Honky and Savage match when Savage and Hogan got together and formed the Mega Powers. Bret Hart was the one that really cost Savage the title that night, so this was kind of a grudge match, and it was awesome. Bret worked over Savage's ankle throughout the whole match, even took his boot off, and Savage had to wrestle basically on one foot and wound up just barely beating Bret in one of my favorite Saturday night's main event matches of all time, way, way, way before Bret was even considered to ever be a singles champion in the WWE. So if you've never seen that match, check it out. Because other than that, I think they crossed paths a time or two in WCW, and I think had one other match overseas at some point, and that was like it for those guys. So to see them get into it here at the Survivor Series was great because they were in and out of the ring with each other a couple of different times. Also very cool to see Danny Davis. There was more than one interesting referee thing going on this show, and this one was kind of cool for me to see referee Danny Davis refereeing an exchange between Randy Savage and Bret the Hitman Hart. Danny Davis was instrumental in both of these guys winning titles in 1986 and 1987. Danny Davis was the referee for Randy Savage versus Tito Santana when Savage used a foreign object to win the Intercontinental title. Tito blamed Danny Davis for that loss. That's why Tito was included into the six-man match at WrestleMania 3. And Danny Davis was also the crooked-ass ref in the British Bulldogs and Hart Foundation match in 87 when it was basically 2-on-1 against Davey, and Danny Davis fast counted Davey Boy out, and the Harts won the title. So now, fast forward a couple of years, he's reinstated. He's no longer a wrestler anymore, and now he's refereeing these two guys facing each other. Just kind of an interesting wrestling tidbit there. We had Dino Bravo. I literally just watched the Dino Bravo Dark Side of the Ring episode last night, and that was something else. Man, so sad what wound up happening to him. He would eliminate Rugged Ronnie Garvin, I believe, with a side slam. We have Bret and Savage going at it again. Bret gets worked over by all three guys. Savage's team really kind of cut the ring off there and started beating the shit out of Bret for a while. He finally hot tags Hacksaw Jim Duggan. He goes nuts and cleans house. Eventually, Bret finds himself back in the ring and gets eliminated by Randy Savage's top rope elbow. So this leaves Hacksaw Jim Duggan to face three guys all by himself. It's 3 against 1, and Duggan really works the crowd here. It's great shit. I mean, he's facing insurmountable odds here, but he kicks the shit out of all 3 of these guys to a huge pop from the crowd. But eventually, the numbers game catches up with him. They beat the crap out of him, and they keep Duggan relatively protected here. He only loses via countout. He can't get back in the ring. He takes too much of a beating, so he gets counted out. And Dino Bravo, the Earthquake, and Randy Savage are your survivors in this match. And after it's over, Hacksaw Jim Duggan goes out to the outside, grabs his 2x4, and cleans house with the 2x4. A lot of sore loser baby faces on this show. Next up, we had the Genius reading a Thanksgiving poem on the podium. I miss these days of having the podium there. They would do a lot of interviews and shit like that on some of the TV shows back in the 80s and the 90s. I always missed that setup and kind of wish they would bring it back. I think they've brought it back for some reunion shows and shit, but I would like to see it be a more permanent fixture. I really miss that. Lanny loved his poems, man. I remember him back when he was Leaping Lanny Poffo, and he would throw the Frisbees out to the crowd and everything. Such a weird dude, and the Genius was such a goofy-ass character. So he was up there reading his Thanksgiving poem, and that was that. Next up was a match that I thought going into this pay-per-view was going to be the main event. It was the $1 Million Team versus the Hulkamaniacs. Captain Ted DiBiase teaming up with the Powers of Pain and Zeus, which was really weird. I thought some of these pairings were odd here. The Hulkamaniacs team that's captained by Hogan consists of him, Jake Roberts, and Demolition, which I thought was a really cool babyface group. I thought they looked great together. Hogan and Jake and Demolition, those guys, especially like Demolition getting that Hulk Hogan rub. But part of me felt like some of these team members should have been different. At the time, Hulk Hogan really wasn't feuding with the $1 Million Man. He had his issues with the $1 Million Man the previous year, but their issue was pretty much done. $1 Million Man was in the middle of a feud with Jake the Snake Roberts. So you really thought this should have been Team $1 Million Man versus Team Jake, and Jake have some other guys with him. And the fact that the $1 Million Man has Zeus with him, when Zeus has been spending all of his time with Randy Savage, teamed up with him at SummerSlam, and would go on to face Hogan and Brutus the following month. That's probably why they didn't team them up here, so they wouldn't do it at 2 back-to-back shows. But considering where everyone was in storyline at the time, I kind of thought the teams should have been Hulk Hogan, Brutus Beefcake, and Demolition versus Randy Savage and Zeus and Powers of Pain. But things were a little bit goofy here, and probably the big match they would have on the 27th is a reason why. They would go on to plug that several times, and we'll talk about it after the match as well. But they were really hyping up during this pay-per-view the big match, cage match, no holds barred, the match and the movie, taking place between Savage and Zeus and Beefcake and Hogan. They would be locked in that big blue bar cage, and that was the feature match on one of the super tapes they did back in the day. I have the digital copy of that show. I have it on my hard drive, but I don't have the physical media of that super tape. It was a little bit too pricey, I think, for me to pick up. But I do have the show, and I've seen the match a bunch of times, but it's nothing that great, and they spent a lot of time during this show plugging that. Now, the reason that these guys were with the $1 Million Man is because he was offering them money. He was offering the Powers of Pain and Zeus money, and it was pretty funny when Zeus came in after the No Holds Barred movie because he was an actor and didn't really have any wrestling experience and didn't know what the hell he was doing in there, but my God, was he scary as fuck. He was every bit as big, if not bigger, than most of the guys in that locker room. He certainly looked like a wrestler. He had a great look. That Z on the side of his head and that Google eye of his. He looked like a fucking monster. But they also, during this time, had to be really careful not to expose him for how bad he was. And they did a pretty good job of that at SummerSlam, and you could tell when he was in there and he actually had to take bumps and shit. He really didn't know what he was doing. He was as stiff as a board, but I think under the circumstances, he did a great job. I mean, he really did. You can't judge him as a wrestler when he's not a fucking wrestler, never wanted to be. So for somebody that they just put in there and put in pay-per-view main events, more than one, I mean, I think it could have been worse. Now, Zeus's monster status had already been kind of squashed at SummerSlam because Hogan, I believe, pinned Zeus at SummerSlam. So this idea that he's some unbeatable wrecking machine that can kill anyone is kind of already dead by this point, but he's still a very scary individual. So Hogan and Zeus want to start the match off with each other. I can't remember who wanted who first. It might have been Zeus that wanted Hogan. Point is, they start the match off, and they basically have Zeus snap to where he just chokes Hulk Hogan relentlessly to where the referee can't pry Zeus off of him, and he's doing the 5 count. Zeus won't answer the 5 count, and right off the bat, before the match basically even starts, they disqualify Zeus. So Zeus is gone just like that, which was a pretty good way of getting him out of the match without having to beat him. And he's sent out of there, and Jesse again mentions the match in December. He goes, there's nobody to DQ Zeus in the cage match because it's no holds barred, and he can choke Hogan for days if he wants to. So they were really using a pay-per-view to hype up another show that wasn't even on pay-per-view. It's pretty crazy looking back at it. We had Axe and Smash of the Demolition and the Powers of Pain also rekindling their rivalry here because, for those of you who are early Survivor Series scholars like myself, you'll remember they did the double turn between these two teams the previous year. I talk all about that in my 87 and 88 review that I mentioned earlier. And back then, Axe and Smash were captaining the heel team. Powers of Pain were captaining the babyface team. Fuji turns on Demolition in the match and sides with the Powers of Pain. They survive, turn heel, and Demolition went on to have a long babyface run, and they even defeated the Powers of Pain in their feud. They worked at WrestleMania earlier on in the year. It was a handicap match. Demolition putting the titles on the line against the Powers of Pain and Mr. Fuji, 3-on-2, and Demolition beat him. So I kind of felt, much like Hogan and DiBiase, that Powers of Pain and Demolition's issue were basically done. They had no business really even feuding at this point, and the Powers of Pain were on the verge of being split up. Barbarian would go with Heenan, and Warlord would go with Slick. So they're kind of rekindling that rivalry here really late in 1989. And the craziest thing about this is the champs got beat. Powers of Pain, after that entire year of kind of losing to Demolition, they never won the titles. They came up on the short end of the stick. The Powers of Pain eliminated both members of Demolition here. First, Mr. Fuji trips Axe when he's running the ropes, and he falls down, and he gets pinned by the Warlord. And after that, the Barbarian pins Smash with a top rope clothesline. So both members of Demolition were eliminated by both members of Powers of Pain. So this now really tips the scales back into DiBiase's team's favor because it's 3-on-2, Powers of Pain and Ted against Jake and Hogan. So Jake gets himself caught in the ring. He's being worked over good by all three guys while Hogan watches helplessly. They even do the thing where the babyface comes into the ring and the referee, pushes him back, allowing all three members of the team to beat the shit out of poor Jake. So Hogan isn't helping matters with his frustration on the outside of the ring. Eventually, finally, Hogan gets the hot tag after Barbarian misses a top rope headbutt onto Jake. And I always liked the Barbarian. He had a really interesting type of athleticism for someone his size. He was so fast and so quick and extremely flexible, especially in his legs. I loved some of the kicks that he would deliver. Barbarian was great. And I'll tell you what, man, this is one of those occasions that I've mentioned in years past that every now and then you will find Hulk Hogan. I can't believe I'm saying this out loud, but you will find Hulk Hogan doing some pretty decent wrestling. When he wants to wrestle, he can wrestle. And here he kind of mixes it up with Barbarian a little bit and throws a suplex and some takedowns and gets a couple of near falls. Like almost in a style that you would see today. A quick move, a cover, 1-2, kick out. Another quick move, cover, 1-2, kick out. Hogan wrestling that way is always bizarre to see. And you would see him do that more if he was doing a tour in Japan or something. But every now and then, you would see him do some pretty crazy shit. And him and Barbarian had a nice little exchange. It was really good. I got to hand it to Hogan. Every now and then, he'd surprise you. Hogan and Jake would go on to have a really big lucky break here after things started to break down. The Powers of Pain start double teaming Hogan and actually hit him with a spike pile driver from the second rope, which the referee sees and disqualifies both members of Powers of Pain. So 3/4 of Ted DiBiase's team have been disqualified. That's kind of crazy. I'm surprised they put the Powers of Pain over this big. Maybe that's because they were about to split them up into singles and they wanted to make them and keep them as strong as possible by having them beat Demolition and not getting beat in the match itself. So they DQ'd those guys, and now it's 2 against 1. And by the way, Jesse Ventura is flipping the fuck out. He thinks Hogan has got the referee in his pocket. And I mentioned the interesting referee scenario earlier on with Danny Davis reffing Randy Savage and Bret Hart. Here's another interesting scenario. Now, this referee appears to be Earl, if my eyesight is correct, and to see Earl Hebner refereeing a $1 Million Man and Hulk Hogan match when he was instrumental in taking the title off of Hogan a year before on NBC in 1988 when they did the twin referee thing with him and Dave. So every time WWE pulled some shady shit with one of the referees, they kind of just dropped the angle. Next thing you know, one day, Danny Davis is just back as a referee again after all the fucked up shit he did. And then arguably one of the biggest scandals in wrestling history, The ultimate screw job, twin referees conspiring with the $1 Million Man and being paid off to screw Hulk Hogan out of a title reign that lasted over 4 years. How the fuck is this guy still a referee? Shouldn't he be banned for life, much like Danny Davis was, but for life means 3 years? And I don't know why I'm getting all hot and bothered about this. I just find it hilarious that Earl Hebner was the referee for this thing. But anyway, poor Ted DiBiase is all alone now, and he actually has the advantage on Hogan. He's beaten Hogan up, and now it's Hogan the one trying to make the hot tag to Jake the Snake Roberts. He finally does. He reaches Jake. Jake comes in, starts kicking the shit out of the $1 Million Man. You would see Virgil get involved here, causing all sorts of problems. He would then eat a DDT, and that would allow Ted DiBiase to roll up Jake with a cradle and use his foot on the ropes as leverage to pin Jake Roberts, and he's eliminated, leaving you down to Hulk Hogan and the $1 Million Man to battle, which they did, but you know how this is going to end up. Of course, it's 1989. Hulk Hogan is your world champion. Every match ends with the 3 punches, big boot, and leg drop, and this was no different, and Ted DiBiase sold these moves magnificently. Excellent job by the $1 Million Man. He went down, Hogan pinned him 1, 2, 3, and he is the sole survivor of the Hulkamaniacs team. So like I said earlier, it's pretty interesting that this match was not the main event. You would think that it would be. Hogan's the world champion. And we'll talk about the main event here in a minute. And you had to think based on watching this, that WWE had the idea for the WrestleMania 6 main event way before it was announced on TV. We cut backstage now for some more setup to the December 27th match. We've got a Randy Savage and Zeus promo with Sean Mooney. They start talking some smack. We then cut to another locker room where Hulk Hogan and Brutus Beefcake are celebrating their respective victories, and they're interviewed by Mean Gene. Sensational Sherry appears and starts talking shit to them. She eventually tosses some powder in both of their eyes, temporarily blinding them. Savage and Zeus then bust into the locker room and attack, and they're beating the crap out of Hogan and Beefcake, and then the entire locker room shows up and starts pulling Zeus and Savage off of Hogan and Beefcake. So they are really doing a lot to promote that cage match over Christmas. We're kind of like in intermission time here. They would do this a lot in the early days of WWE pay-per-views. They would sometimes take a big break where they would do several backstage interviews. They talked to the announcers for a bit, basically just giving the fans a breather from all the wrestling. So we had Jesse and Gorilla now having a little chat. And Jesse Ventura lets the audience know at home that there's something going on in the Heenan family. There's some sort of dissension, and apparently there was even some pushing and shoving backstage. Now, we're going to talk about this when we get to the main event, but there's a big story here involving Tully Blanchard with all of this Heenan family dissension talk, so we'll get into that later. We had a Rude's Brood promo next because they're about to go out there and take on a team captained by Roddy Piper. Awesome promo here with the 2 Minnesota boys, Ravishing Rick Rude and Kurt Hennig. They're joined by the fabulous Rougeau brothers, who are doing the All-American Boys gimmick at the time. Rick Rude even has the entire team on his airbrushed tights, which was awesome. After that, we had Mean Gene catching up with Roddy's Rowdies. They're coming down the staircase, and he kind of intercepts them. This is so funny because I remember a lot of the promos for this on TV at the time, and I even remember watching the Survivor Series Showdown. And back in the day, they would do these little pre-shows on the USA Network like on Sunday night prior to the Thursday show. And they would do this for several pay-per-views. SummerSlam would have one, and I loved these special events because they would usually consist of matches pitting a certain team member against each other. And it was always a lot of fun and a great way to hype up the pay-per-view cards back then. And I remember during all of the promos involving Piper and his team, he would always treat these guys and talk about them like they were zoo animals. It was so fucking funny because his team consisted of the Bushwhackers and Jimmy Snuka. And when Mean Gene catches them in the backstage area, they've all got like chicken bones and they're gnawing on them and shit. And basically, Piper is feeding them. He's treating them like animals. Hey, go out there and win this match and I'll feed you chicken, which is just fucking crazy. And really interesting. I thought this as a kid too. I could not believe that Roddy Piper and Jimmy Snuka were teammates with all their bad blood. And you would see that a lot during Survivor Series years. You would see guys that came out of a vicious feud, and now they both happen to be either a heel or a babyface, and now they're on the same team. I remember being floored in 1987 when Randy Savage teamed up with Ricky the Dragon Steamboat. I watched those two guys fight each other in the Pontiac Silverdome. That was one of the gnarliest feuds ever, with what Savage did to Steamboat and his neck and the attacks that he laid down on him, and their really brutal battle for the Intercontinental title. And now they're teammates? That blew my mind. So here we are again, just a few years removed from the brutal coconut incident, and Piper and Snuka find themselves on the same team. I thought that was interesting. Both teams make their entrance out to the arena. Now, WWE apparently doesn't own the rights to Ravishing Rick Rude's music, which I never knew that. So I was watching this on the WWE Network. I have my own copy of this, but the network is just easier to pull up. So I was watching that for all of my note-taking, and seeing Rick Rude come out there in some bullshit generic music is so annoying. He had the best theme back in the day. So we get all the guys in the ring here, and this match wound up telling a really hilarious story to me, because like I said, Roddy Piper was treating his teammates like animals, like they were just caged fucking animals, and like they're not even real humans. And the other team is very cerebral. You know, you've got the Rougeau brothers, you know, Ray, I'm a huge mark for Ray Rougeau, always have been. They're very smart wrestlers with wrestling in their family. They're managed and backed up by Jimmy Hart. And you got Rick Rude and Kurt Hennig, who are two of the best to ever do it. So you would think that their team is going to be so cohesive, and they're going to have the shit together, and they're going to easily outsmart, out-wrestle, and outclass their animalistic opponents, right? But that's the opposite of what happened here. Piper's team right off the bat showed amazing continuity. They were fast tagging in and out. They were working body parts. They were cutting the ring in half. It was fucking hysterical. And they got off to a great start. Jacques Rougeau got eliminated first after a Superfly splash. And then after that, Roddy Piper eliminated Ray Rougeau with a pile driver. So just like that, it's 4-2. Roddy's Rowdies against Perfect and Rude. Poor Mr. Perfect finds himself getting worked over by all four guys. He is just getting his ass kicked and selling everything like $1 million, like only Perfect can do. But he did wind up turning the tables, got a roll up on Bushwhacker Luke, and eliminated him. He would then get a tag into Rick Rude, who would then eliminate the other Bushwhacker with the Rude Awakening. So now it's Rude and Perfect versus Piper and Snuka. Which, again, when I see Piper and Snuka on the same side together, just the two of them, it's really fucking eerie for my 1989 brain to comprehend. And Rude and Perfect go on to control and dominate Snuka for what felt like forever. I swear, 4 to 5 good minutes, they are working this fucker over. And finally, he's able to get the hot tag into Roddy. He comes in like a house of fire, and we finally get that showdown between Rick Rude and Roddy Piper. I loved this feud between these two guys, by the way. I used to watch it build on Primetime Wrestling when Piper would sit in as a co-host with Gorilla sometimes, and then they would have the Bobby Heenan show, which I still think should have lasted far longer than it did. And Rude was on there, and they were kind of getting into it. I think they even had an attack and a little fight on the set of Primetime during one of these weeks, and Piper was very instrumental also in Rick Rude losing back the Intercontinental title to the Ultimate Warrior at SummerSlam. I think he mooned him or some shit and distracted Rude and allowed the Warrior to beat Rude and get his belt back. So I loved the build-up, and I loved the feud between these two, and I thought it was really good. So unfortunately, nothing would be settled here. Once Piper and Rude started getting into it, they spill on the outside of the ring, and they're just brawling their balls off, and they brawl all the way to the back, and they both get counted out. We had a lot of countouts and DQs on this show. A lot of guys WWE did not want to pin or beat. I think there was a total of 6 or 7 total countouts, and we'll get to a big one later, too, in the main event. So this leaves us now one-on-one, Mr. Perfect versus Jimmy Superfly Snuka. And Perfect was on the rise during this time. WWE had plans for him. He would go on and win the Intercontinental title right after WrestleMania 6 when the Warrior had to forfeit it, and he would hook up with Bobby the Brain Heenan. Now, he wasn't quite there yet, but it was obvious one-on-one, Snuka and Perfect. Perfect is going to win. These two guys used to wrestle a lot on Primetime Wrestling, and a lot of TV matches and a lot of house show matches, and Perfect won every time, and this was no different. Perfect plex on Snuka, 1, 2, 3, and Mr. Perfect is the sole survivor. So that's 2 years in a row for him, as he was one of the survivors on his 1988 team as well, but things would not work out so well for him the following year in 1990, if I remember right. We cut backstage again for a post-match celebration with Rude's Brood. They're very happy, and I think it was Sean Mooney doing the interview there, and he asked Rick Rude about the dissension in the Heenan family because throughout that whole match, Bobby Heenan wasn't out there. So they were really alluding to the fact that something's going on behind the scenes in the Heenan family locker room. Then we get the big promo with the Ultimate Warriors team. The Warriors consisted of team captain the Ultimate Warrior, the Rockers, and Jim the Anvil Neidhart. So this promo was about as crazy as you'd expect. It don't get much crazier. Like, think about this. When there's 4 guys sitting there and Shawn Michaels is the least crazy of the 4, holy shit, that's a crazy team. So this was fun. They were all going out of their mind. The Ultimate Warrior was grabbing on Jim's beard. That was all fun. So they're all hyped up. They're ready for their match, and they start making their way to the arena. Now, the Heenan family, they hit the ring first. Now, this team is supposed to be comprised of team captain Andre the Giant, Haku, and the Brainbusters. Now, when they go to the ring, you see Andre, you see Haku, you see Arn, but you don't see Tully. You see Bobby the Brain Heenan in his wrestling gear. And Jesse and Gorilla, they don't seem to know why. So they didn't really explain this. I mean, they can't really tell the truth of what happened here, but I thought they would maybe explain it a little more. So basically how they explain this is there was just dissension in the Heenan family and somebody must have got kicked out. Now, the real story of what went on here was with the Brainbusters and with Tully Blanchard. He failed a drug test that day when he showed up to Survivor Series. Tested positive for cocaine and was pulled from the card. And him and Arn were also on their way out. They only came into the WWE for about a year and a half or some shit. So they were heading back to the NWA, probably to return there as a tag team. Tully gets busted, and he has to be replaced here by Bobby the Brain Heenan. Now, after this, like immediately after this event, Arn would be gone. I think this was his last night. I don't think he worked again, and he would head back to the NWA and apparently leave on pretty good terms. And NWA had an offer in to him and Tully to return. They were all set to go back there, but after Tully failed the drug test, the NWA declined their offer, and Tully went on to the AWA. So this was kind of the end, and it really shouldn't have been. It was just the way wrestling was back in the day. Wrestlers really, some of them anyway, had a really tough time of keeping their shit together, and Tully failed this one bad. So he was out of there, and he wouldn't even be able to join Arn in NWA after this, and they replaced Tully with Bobby the Brain Heenan, which you would think just puts them at an enormous disadvantage. But they didn't really have anybody else to grab, especially when the name of your team is the Heenan family. Mr. Perfect wasn't there yet, and Rude was captaining his own team. So you really didn't have any options. It kind of put him in a tight spot and probably got Tully a little bit of more heat. But Bobby Heenan was funny in the ring. You know, he's underrated. Now, by the time 1989 rolled around, he couldn't do that much, but he was super fast and super quick. One of my favorite wrestlers from the 70s and one of my favorite guys to go back and watch tape of is Ray Stevens. And Ray Stevens and Heenan were a lot alike in terms of how they moved in the ring and their size. Ray Stevens was just a little bit better, but Bobby Heenan, he would wrestle a bunch of matches against the Warrior. Here in WWE, he would wrestle matches in the AWA. He would do the weasel suit matches in both promotions, and he would get in the ring and let himself get embarrassed from time to time. He worked about a 5-second match at WrestleMania 5 earlier on in the year against Terry Taylor. So he's back in the ring here again, and I always loved that he wore the little Andre the Giant singlet. He looked terrible. But I'll tell you what, he kind of lasted for a while in this match. This was really interesting. So as the heels make their way to the ring first, the baby faces come out next. I think it starts with the Rockers and then with the Anvil. And as soon as the Anvil gets in the ring, Andre attacks. So you only have 3 of the 4 team members out there. Andre's already started the match. He's attacking all these guys, beating the shit out of them. The Ultimate Warrior winds up making his entrance without any music because he basically has to do a run-in now and save his teammates. And he hits the ring and he clotheslines Andre the Giant. And when I think about where Andre was in his life during this time, this was a crazy bump for him to take. He went flying over the top rope and sold it like $1 million and went face down to the floor. So the Ultimate Warrior, to see the way he was laying, I'll put it up here on the screen here, to see his arm out sideways like that, he looked like he was dead. That's a dead giant right there. Well, since he attacked and got the match started, he's the legal man. So he got clotheslined over the top rope. He can't get back in the ring, and he's counted out. Just like that, Andre's gone. So Andre and Zeus had very, very quick eliminations in both of their respective matches. So that was kind of a surprise. And now you would think the Heenan family is fucked because it's essentially 4-on-2. Andre is gone, and now one of your team members left is Bobby Heenan, who is useless. But you got to hand it to Haku and Arn. I mean, they fought their asses off. Haku would wind up pinning the Anvil after a kick to the back of the head. Anvil goes down. Haku pins him. Bobby the Brain Heenan comes in and pins Marty Jannetty. After Haku and Arn did all the work, beat the fuck out of him, Heenan demands a tag. He gets tagged in and pins Marty Jannetty. That was a great spot. And that left the Ultimate Warrior and Shawn Michaels against all 3 guys. And it was interesting to see Shawn and Warrior as a tag team. Now, Shawn would pin Haku after a top rope high cross body with a little push-off from the Warrior. I like that. A little tag team wrestling between these two. We would have Arn Anderson and Bobby the Brain Heenan beginning to not get along. They're kind of arguing on the outside of the ring a little bit. Arn Anderson would wind up pinning Shawn Michaels with one of his awesome spine busters. That was great. Shawn goes down, leaving the Ultimate Warrior all by himself against Arn Anderson and Bobby the Brain Heenan, but this should not be too difficult of a mountain to climb for the Warrior. What was really interesting about this, too, is twice during the match, 2 different times, Bobby Heenan climbs up to the top rope and teases a top rope dive. The first time, Shawn Michaels is on the outside of the ring. The second time, the Warrior's on the outside of the ring. And both times, Heenan climbs up to the top rope as if he's going to dive off. I don't know if he had really intended to do that and then had a change of heart or chickened out or what, but for him to tease that twice, I thought was really hilarious. The Ultimate Warrior, of course, would eventually wind up eliminating Arn Anderson, leaving Bobby the Brain Heenan all alone to face off with the Warrior. And at this point, I think they had some Weasel matches before, so they were not strangers to each other. Bobby Heenan famously could not stand the Ultimate Warrior because he was a fucking reckless maniac in the ring. Bobby Heenan absolutely detested working with this guy. But this here, everything they did here looked pretty safe. The Warriors beating the shit out of Heenan. And like I said, when I compare Bobby Heenan to Ray Stevens, he could just bump his ass off. And he did. He sold everything like $1 zillion for the Warrior. He even tries to cower away and run away from the Warrior, trying to leave and get himself intentionally counted out. Warrior goes and fetches him, brings him back into the ring, hits him with a flying tackle, hits him with a splash, and hits him with the 1-2-3. And the Ultimate Warrior is your sole survivor in your main event. And the writing was starting to become visible on the wall now that Hulk Hogan was basically a mid-carder on this show, and he's world champion, and he was the sole survivor of his team too. And I think considering you had a last-minute replacement with Tully missing the show, you probably should have swapped the matches and had them done in reverse order and have Ultimate Warrior's match done earlier on, unless they needed that extra time to come up with an idea of what they're going to do and who they're going to put in that match. And that's why they bumped it to the main event. I'm really not sure. But the Ultimate Warrior was the last one to be seen on this pay-per-view, and it was a pretty good Survivor Series. I mean, considering, like I said, they changed their format here dramatically from the first 2 years. I thought this Survivor Series was really entertaining. The one thing I did notice about some of those previous years, because there were so many team members, is sometimes the matches would drag on. Sometimes they would go a little bit long. I felt like this Survivor Series was a little bit more action-packed compared to the first two, and I always loved this time period. I mean, 1987 through like 1993 were a great time for me as a fan. I remember everything from this time period, and this Survivor Series was no different. I remember the build. I remember what happened after. I remember what all these guys would go on to do, and it was just a glorious time. And like I say in all of my retro reviews, it was a very different and simpler time, and a time that sometimes I wish we could have back. So anyway, I want to thank you guys for hanging out with me today and taking a look back at this classic Survivor Series show from way back in 1989. If you have any memories of the show, or if you have any opinions or thoughts or questions about it, feel free to leave them in the comments below. Anything that I missed or I should have elaborated on, please let me know all of that as well. Big, special, heartfelt thank you to Scott Moss for sponsoring this video. I appreciate your support, my man, and I appreciate all of you guys for hanging out with us today. Y'all be good. I will talk to you very soon. Until next time. Peace.